Thank you.
Great, thank you. And if everybody could turn off their cameras and their microphones, that would also help as well. Thank you.
Thank
There
you
we go.
so
So,
much for inviting. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about the angel roofs of Norfolk. As you were saying, my research covered angel roofs across East Anglia, but with a particular focus on Norfolk and Suffolk. Although it can be difficult to stick to county boundaries at some points. Ian mentioned my fear of heights, which first struck me when I first went up scaffolding at St Nicholas Chapel in King's Lynn in 2015. And I went up about 5 times, and it was terrifying every time. But it was a really good opportunity to get close up to the beam angels and to the other structural and adornment elements in that roof, which turned out to be a really significant early example and an important model for a lot of other roofs in the west of the region. And it also enabled me to see examples of restoration. For example, details uh, of oak against restoration pine in this example on the figure of an angel, some fairly harsh and unsympathetic um, uh, uh, activities by restorers, such as this nail in an eye, and also to confirm things like the fact that although the guidebook said that the roof featured the earliest example of a representation of a recorder in church art, it was in fact 19th century. Um, where did I start and where are surviving late medieval angel roofs? Well, I started with a list from Dana Bentley Cranch and her associate, and also Michael Rimmer very kindly gave me a list he'd put together. But I pretty quickly realised it was going to be pretty impossible to try and count precisely how many angel roofs there are, either in Norfolk, East Anglia, or elsewhere. There still is no definitive list of angel roofs across the whole of England and Wales. An increasing number have become obvious. People like the Chester Cadwells have mapped those down in places like Somerset. There are quite a few in the West Country, quite a few in Wales, York, all over the place, really. But certainly in Norfolk, we are very fortunate to have a lot of surviving medieval churches, and a number of them have significant roofs. I also realised that in quite a few churches there was more than one angel roof at places, for example, like Outwell or Wymondham and so forth, where you have aisle roofs as well as nave or through build nave and chancel roofs. Um, One thing that I did do was to try and map different roof types across the region, and also to think about the types of structures that craftspeople were using to try and develop this type of roof. And some of their strategies were certainly already tried and tested, and some of them were new and a little bit more daring or innovatory. So I'm going to take you through, in particular, four roof types which Norfolk Angel roofs tend to feature. There are a couple of other roof types that you find elsewhere, but predominantly Norfolk roofs follow four particular types. And I'm going to start with arch braced roofs and single hammer beam roofs. And it's worth noting that in a number of cases, a roof might feature more than one of those structural types combined together, um, probably because people are erring on the side of caution. So I'm going to start, I'm having to rattle through these because I've probably got too many slides, but I'm going to start with a particularly lovely example of an arch braced angel roof from fairly early in the 15th century. All of these roofs I'm talking about are 15th century or early 16th century. and we'll think about why in a bit. But you can see that this structural type, it's quite elegant, but it's also quite spare. It's economical. It lends itself to the peppering of lots of little tiny carved relief figures, little half angels, which you find along the ridge at the top of the roof and along what we call the wall plate or the cornice lower down. And you can find also where principal structural elements, principal rafters and purlins meet. So it's a generalized effect. Um, a very well-known church, Saul, in North Norfolk, features a lot of very important church art, but I think the roofs there probably go rather overlooked quite often. And I had a good look at them. Causton is just down the road, and we'll come back to Causton a bit because a lot of people know about the roof at Causton in the nave. But at Saul, the nave and the chancel roofs are both actually arch braced roofs, so they're fairly traditional structures. In the nave, there's been a lot of restoration, but there's still some evidence of colour, and there are tiny little demi angels at where the principal elements meet. In the chancel, the roof is actually boarded. It looks a little bit more sophisticated, perhaps, and it features a series of bosses related to the life of Christ at the ridge. But then where some of the other elements meet, there are tiny little, quite damaged angels. They're quite small, but it's quite clear that they represent some of the higher orders of angels, which people were aware of at the time. Um, and I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but through a book called The Golden Legend, people would have been aware of an actually much earlier concept that suggested that there was a hierarchy of angels, from those at the top, like cherubim and seraphim, who were closest to God, down to ordinary angels closest to humanity. And I've just included in this slide, just to give a bit of an idea of what we're talking about, there's a well-known alabaster depiction of the nine orders, which is now at Norwich Cathedral. But it's interesting that in church art that depicts the nine orders, it's often very difficult to know who's who, because some of these types of angels aren't described in Scripture or the Bible. So often people had to label them, and their representations can vary. Um, I'm talking about angel roofs. Angels are much less common on rood screens, and there are only 4 screens in Norfolk and Suffolk that really focus on angels, and Barton Turf is perhaps the most famous example. And I'm showing cherubim here alongside principalities, and they are actually labelled on the screen to make sure that we know who's who, and perhaps to add some authority to their representations. But normally, rood screens depicted saints, doctors of the church, and so forth. And I've actually written in one of my publications about what I think the hierarchy of representation was with the roofs above. And I've also depicted a bit of glass from St Peter Hungate in Norwich, because angels are very common in stained glass, and here we have a nice feathered example. And one of the reasons why I'm showing you these feathered images is because feathered angels are actually not as common as angels wearing ecclesiastical costume. Ordinary angels, I think, who are meant to be closer to us on the roofs. Moving on structurally, here we've got an example of an alternating, relatively early hammer beam and arch brace nave roof, which is well known, and it's at Necton in mid to West Norfolk. and it's a very good example because it still has surviving pigment, which has been written about, and it clearly follows some of the tendencies that I found in a lot of West Norfolk roofs in terms of the angels being dressed, wearing albs and amices or other clerical costume, so they look as if they're holding the mass up in the roof, mirroring what's going on the ground. And they either have their hands in prayer or they're holding musical instruments or instruments of Christ's passion, of his suffering. Um, a very different hammer beam roof interpretation is found in Norwich at St Peter Mancroft. And this roof is interesting for a number of reasons. One is that it's one of the angel roofs that is what we call an open build or through build roof, spanning the nave and the chancel. It looks like one structure. In actual fact, there are two roof structures behind this facade, one of which is apparently better than the other. But the other thing that's interesting about this roof is that the you can't see the hammer beams because the design has timber vaulting or faux vaulting to it, which is a very unusual design. It has heavenly associations. Where the little angels are is where the ends of the beams would be. And I also found it interesting that with this roof, that within the nave area, that the structure is actually linked to the aisle roofs, both of which you could call angel roofs, although they've got tiny little angels and they're easily missed. And we also have other imagery. We have heads, corbel heads below, some of which are certainly timber, which appear to depict perhaps contemporary people, as well as a couple of clerical figures. And a number of angel roofs have additional imagery alongside them. At Mancroft, the niches are now empty. Did they have figures within them? We'll probably never know. And that design is only found elsewhere in Norfolk at Ringland, uh, where it appears to have been created by different craftspeople, but certainly following that Mancroft design. And the only other place that I've seen this type of vaulted roof is at Framlingham in Suffolk, which is not an angel roof. And at Framlingham, the design of the vaulting seems to relate to the rood screen vaulting at Bramfield in Suffolk. Um, Coming back to Norwich to St Peter Hungate, this lovely photo by Michael Rimmer. A lot of the photos are mine, but Michael's always been very generous with his photos. And here you can see the rather inferior replacement chancel roof, but the Hungate roof spans the nave and the transepts in a very elegant vaulted manner. It's a really coherent design and a very sophisticated design. And I'm actually currently planning an exhibition at Hungate next year about the roof in context for anyone who's interested. So, very sophisticated design with unusual beam angels under the ends of the beams, and also with an important boss showing Christ in judgment over the centre of the crossing, and also some very nice. Nicely carved stone bosses at the ends of the longer wall posts, depicting at the crossing, they depict the evangelists, and there are others depicting the four doctors of the church. Now, this design, this vaulted design, was very unusual. It appears to have been copied not long after at St Mary Coslaney. I should say the Hungate roof probably dates earlier than a lot of people think. Probably started in the 1440s, and it seems pretty certain that the roof over the crossing at St Mary Coslaney follows that kind of vaulted design with slightly different imagery. There are angels around the vaulting, but in the centre there's Mary surrounded by light. So it's a more Marian kind of scheme. not quite as elaborate. And the only other example is at Stoddy St Mary in North Norfolk. I'm pretty sure there would have been links between the Pastons in Norwich and other patrons, which account for this, but the Stoddy roof's been quite heavily restored. Um, Coming back to St Peter Hungate, a closer look at a couple of the beam angels. They really are remarkable. In the nave, there's one holding the Book of Seven Seals from Revelation, and I've seen angels holding books elsewhere, but then don't usually have this much fine detail. Um, in the crossing by the chancel arch, there's a representation of an armoured angel, presumably St Michael, which again as far as I know, it's a unique representation of the subject. And I should explain at this point that some roofs have changed in appearance quite considerably because of restoration and other work to them. And at Hungate, the whole effect is rather distorted by the fact that at some point someone slapped this rather dark treatment over the oak. Most angel roofs are English oak, and so this should look nice and silvery now, but it looks rather dark. And perhaps because of that, somebody in the 20th century has then gone and painted the angels gold. And I'm afraid the only time I've ever come across gold angels in an angel roof is reading Dorothy Sayers' Nine Tailors. So I really don't think that's how they were intended to look originally. Um, there is additional imagery at Hungate, as I mentioned. Here's a detailed close up of that beautiful boss, showing Christ in judgment with some despairing souls below, and then an example of one of the stone corbels showing one of the four doctors of the church. And it's details like this. Dr. Helen Lunnan, who was my second supervisor, spotted the kinks in the drapery here, and there are a number of factors which suggest that the roof at Hungate could have been associated with work at Norwich Cathedral, and this kind of carving is one of those factors. So this was probably carried out by quite elite craftspeople. Um, Moving on to Wymondham North Aisle, the Hungate roof design with these beam angels at the ends of the beams is unusual, and I primarily found it elsewhere at Wymondham Abbey, North Aisle, not the nave roof, but the North Aisle roof, which I think often gets overlooked despite its splendour. Which has primarily angelic beams, as well as one or two other um, uh, elements of imagery in it. And which I think probably has a similar date to the Hungate roof. It has a little bit of pigment at the east end of it, and so there are one or two angels that do have colour to them. But you can see, although it doesn't look as if it's made by the same people, it's got a similar kind of design to it. And this is one of the things that I'm trying to research further because I spotted some similarities here, and then also in a cluster of churches in northeast Norfolk. One of them is at Trunch St Botolph, and there's a rather beautiful late 15th century roof there. And I think this is possibly what the Hungate roof would look more like if it hadn't been treated. Although who knows, perhaps the angels were painted as they are at Wymondham. But a lot of angel roofs appear not to have been painted, and wood itself was admired for its properties in its own right. Again, here, clearly it's not, but not exactly the same design. This is here. It's just a nave roof, and there are slightly different elements like the uh, carving and the spandrels and so on. But it's clearly based on a similar kind of approach. And my thinking is that I think that again that a patron wanted something like Hungate in their church. Um, And I chose this example of one of the beam angels to show that here I actually think this angel has actually been carved into the beam, whereas some of the others that we've seen appear to have been attached under the end of the beam. And I've also included it because what I did find when I was, well, in fact, I still find if I go up scaffolding anywhere, we tend to think often of the destruction of medieval church art in the Civil War and so forth, which did certainly happen a lot in Suffolk and Cambridgeshire. But actually, the greatest enemy of the Norfolk angel, roof angel, um, is a combination of water damage and also insect damage. And I think that point's also made when you look at another one of these northeast Norfolk roofs at Marsham. The other two are at Blakeney and at Banningham, and they all have some remarkable similarities, although they're not necessarily carved by the same people. Certainly not all carved by the same people, and they have other differences. So, for example, at Marsham, somebody's played safe and put some tie beams into this roof to make sure that it stays up. Um, Possibly the most famous hammer beam nave roof in Norfolk is at Corston. And I'm sure a number of people here tonight possibly got the chance to go up the scaffolding when it was up a few years ago. We were able to note the old roof line at the west end, still shown there, um, but also to have a closer look at the angels standing at the ends of the beams and demi angels along the cornice or wall plate, and some of the other bosses that you see above. Now, this roof was certainly a late 15th century roof, and it was an aristocratic roof. It's and a very expensive roof. It's a very unnecessarily expensive design, um, and it certainly you don't have angels standing at the ends of the beams if you're trying to think about the structural side of the roof. The whole point of a roof is to stop outward thrust of the walls, but these angels are purely here for their imagery, not for any other purpose. And you can see how elaborate the beams and the cresting and brushing of the beams is, and so on. There's a lot of unnecessary expenditure to create something impressive. And the second time I went up the scaffolding, I went up with Lucy Rapson from Cambridge, from the Hamilton Carr Institute, and one of her students, Kate Waldron, was researching paint samples from some of the angels, some of the figures there. And they certainly found that it was a very extravagant scheme. And I I think Kate stopped her research for a while, but it will be very interesting to find out the full results of that. Uh, because it will tell us a lot, I think, about the design. Um, Here's my favourite one of the roof angels. Absolutely beautiful from the front. Clearly, more than one pair of wings. Very unusual, not just because they're standing at the ends of the beams, but also because these angels are wearing feathered suits and have more than one set of wings, unlike the majority of roof angels. Of course, they're also not looking down on us below, they're looking across at each other, which is very unusual. And it makes me wonder whether that's one reason why this design was never repeated, partly because it was such an extravagant design, but also in terms of how people at the ground thought of angel roofs, perhaps it didn't seem really to appeal to them quite as much. It's much more heavenly. Um, while I was up the scaffolding, I also looked around the back of some of these angels, and you can see really quite messy restoration work. I mean, angel wings are often replacements anyway in a lot of these roofs, but it doesn't look quite as sophisticated from the back as the front because not as much care has been taken with restoration work there. Um, At the east end of the roof, the first two figures against the east wall are clearly restoration figures. Then they do not relate in any way to the angelic imagery that was really there originally. They're completely fictionalized, so we have to kind of ignore them. But there would have been two more angels at the east end. Um, the figure of Mary then is the next bay along, facing presumably Gabriel, and again traces of pigment in this beautiful figure, and evidence of some really quite expensive work. um, Demi angels along the cornice, the little angels. The original ones hold shields, and we can't really know now whether they would have had heraldry on them at all. But certainly you can spot the restoration ones, which have a much more modern look to them and don't relate to that original design. And then just to show you how there are a number of bosses daubed around the upper part of the roof at the ridge. There are these funny knuckle collar things, and this particular one is under one of those. And then there are some foliate designs as well. So it's quite a complex design. Um, and I just included, just before we move away from single hammer beam roofs, I included a couple of late examples. Um, Angel roofs did continue into the 16th century, and in fact at Helmingham in Suffolk, I found an example after the Reformation, and there's certainly at least one in Wales and so on. But within hammer beam roofs in Norfolk, angels seem to disappear at this stage in some of the roofs. And so at St Lawrence and at Bressingham, which is from the early 16th century, the design of the hammer beams has clearly been undertaken with absolutely no sense that there was ever going to be anything attached to the ends of them. They're quite uh, they have integrity without any angels in them, which is quite interesting. Um, the other two roof types that I wanted to focus on particularly are tie beam roofs with queen posts. Oh gosh, sorry, I just need to go back there, which very predominated in the west of the region, and double hammer beam roofs, which are much more of a Suffolk thing. There are only four in Norfolk, and but I thought I should pop them in. And the fact that there are four around suggests possible links to Suffolk patrons and craftspeople. So, before we look at those, we need to think about why these roofs start appearing at the beginning of the 15th century. Now, we've already seen angels were very important in late medieval Catholic religion, and they're dotted around other parts of the church. But the concept of having an angel roof really comes from the Westminster Hall roof, which was designed and created by Hugh Howland and his team for Richard II. Richard II didn't get to enjoy it, and when the great and the good important clergy and aristocrats saw this roof when Henry IV came to power, it's quite clear that some of them went back to the regions and wanted something reflecting this kind of concept. And none of the angel roofs in the regions replicate this design completely. Obviously, this is a hammer beam roof, but it has some unique features to it. But some of the regional roofs approximate how it looks more than others. Um, and One of the earliest examples of a roof where, in this case, Bishop Despenser was clearly uh, uh, involved in the design of this roof across the nave and the chancel at St Nicholas Chapel of Ease in King's Lynn. In the north of King's Lynn, a sort of burgeoning new area of Lynn with a wealthy merchant community, all a bit fed up that they only had a Chapel of Ease, unlike the Minster. Um, and they basically ploughed a lot of money into this design. And what's interesting about it is it's clearly an attempt to uh, adapt the idea of the beam angel, although the angels are actually underneath planks of wood that go into the wall, as we'll see in a bit. Um, but those angels above the, illuminated by the windows, alternate with tie beams with queen posts. So this is clearly undertaken by local craftspeople, and they're adapting an idea with their local work. So it isn't a case of Hugh Herland coming up to Norfolk and his chaps starting to build stuff. In a lot of cases, we have these local, often travelling people who are doing this sort of work and adapting the idea. And here's a view from the scaffolding through, looking through a tie beam, um, through this forest of queen posts, and there are lots of extra little spandrel designs and things that you can hardly see from up there, let alone from the ground, and additional angelic imagery towards the east end only, and paintwork only in the first eastern bay. So over the altar is particularly sacred, and that's where they put colour. Couldn't find a trace of it anywhere else there. And that roof structure was extremely influential in the west of the region, not just in Norfolk, as at Emneth, but also in Suffolk, in the nave at Mildenhall, at Lakenheath, but also into Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. So it really was a very popular design, and it lent itself, I think, to local craftsmanship because of this combination of tried and tested structural work with this new beam concept. And what's important to note is although St Nicholas was a very early roof, this type of structure prevailed right the way through the century in certain places. And there's more than one example in Cambridgeshire. I just picked on Ireland because we're pretty sure it dates from 1495 because of an inscription along the cornice by the patron, Christopher Peyton. So it just goes to show that that kind of mixture of traditional local craftsmanship and a new idea persisted even when other newer forms of design came in. Um, just briefly touching on double hammer beams, I've had to be really selective here. I've got lots of photos at Napton which I haven't included. Napton probably had a double hammer beam roof in the chancel as well as the um, nave one, which still exists. It has had quite a bit of restoration work. But I've included here Swaffham in the centre of to the west of Norfolk. And the four examples in Norfolk are really spread out. Tilney All Saints very much in the west, Swaffham in the west, and then Gissing in the south, and Napton in the northeast. Now, at Swaffham, the roof is said to be of chestnut rather than oak. That is not terribly usual, but as I say, the majority are actually made of English oak. But you can see again this type of design. It's very extravagant. It's not necessary structurally. But what it does do is lead to a kind of an overwhelming sense of angelic presence. Again, lots of little angels rather than a few really big ones. So it's going for that kind of massing kind of approach with the angels, demi angels at the ends of the beams. And Gissing is interesting because whereas Swaffham was the roof at Swaffham was part of a rebuild that included an upper tier of windows, a clear story, At Gissing, when I first visited Gissing, it's a tiny little church. It's really cute, and I was quite stunned when I walked in and saw this absolute mass of open timber roofing in a building that had not been adapted for it. At Gissing, the Kemp family probably paid for this roof, so it has a slightly kind of Lord of the Manor element to it. A lot of the angels have been replaced, but some of them have not. The lower ones are all Victorian and don't really bear any relation to the probable original design. Um, but just to show you a couple of close-ups at Swaffham, again we've got a chalice on a shield because angels holding instruments of the mass is a thing in a lot of these roofs. Um, Whereas I've chosen a little Gissing a upper angel at the north end just to show you a rather unusual little knightly shield that the angel is holding, which I think may be a nod to the Kent patronage. Uh, just reminding ourselves about Westminster Hall again. Um, Here's a close up of the actual beam angel, a couple of the beam angels at Westminster Hall, and they're incredible carvings. They hold heraldic shields. They're very much knightly angels in the service of the king. But that kind of imagery is not particularly typical of parish church angel roofs. There's always a couple of exceptions to the rule. And so, one early roof in Norwich at St Giles clearly always was a roof with heraldic imagery on the shields held by the angels. There's been a lot of restoration at St Giles, and the paintwork's been analysed by Andrea Kirkham. Uh, but notwithstanding changes and restoration, it's pretty clear when you read Bloomfield's antiquarian account that this probably always was a set of heraldic angels, quite an unusual interpretation. However, a much more powerful model, not just structurally, but in terms of what the angels are holding and how they're dressed and so forth, as I say, was found at St Nicholas. And starting at the east end, the only section of the roof that's painted, there's a pair of angels facing each other. Obviously, they're looking down, but they're opposite each other, mirroring. One holding a book, which could be a missal, some sort of religious book. The other holding a pax, a tablet that would be kissed by the priest and passed round the congregation. You can see the paintwork, which has been analysed. Some of it is medieval, so it gives you an idea of also what they're wearing, the ecclesiastical dress, which is quite a bit of care has been taken to observe that. The feet, little toes there. Angels don't wear shoes, they have toes, which are uh, quite important. The other angels are not painted, and they hold a combination of musical instruments juxtaposed with instruments of Christ's suffering and death. My favourite is the angel with a psaltery. And a master carver called Gerald Adams came up the scaffolding with me once and took these lovely photos. And he was able to talk about how these beam angels were made, the fact that part of the arm is actually added on because the plank element doesn't obviously doesn't come out far enough. And it was really interesting chatting with him about it. And you can see there's been a bit that's been lost there, but it gives you a good idea of the standard of the carving and again, a bit of unsympathetic restoration work. And the wings are actually inserted between the angel and the plank behind, which forms the beam. And I've included this slide just to show you that this idea of having wings slotted in is much more common. Here we've got an example where the wing's been lost at St Nicholas, much more common than folded in wings, which we saw in Northeast Norfolk and at Hungate, and which we also see at Fincham. Um, Back to St Nicholas briefly, another couple of these angels, just to show you musical instruments and a bit of a crown of thorns that's got a bit damaged, the ecclesiastical dress, the lack of colour, note the wavy hairdos and so forth, because you'll see those again. What I did in my thesis was I created a number of plans because basically the roofs I surveyed, I mapped every angel starting at the northeast and going to the northwest, and then starting at the southeast, going to the west. So the lower the number, the closer to the east you are. And I was looking for patterns of imagery, and I found a certain number of similarities, but particularly kind of mirroring across north and south, so that wherever you were sitting, and seating could be by gender actually as much as anything, wherever you were sitting, you were going to see something similar. And I've included this image by Michael Rimmer from Mildenhall Nave because it shows that the same group of craftspeople from Lynn seem to have gone to Mildenhall and undertaken some of the carving at Mildenhall Nave, including this kind of corkscrewy hairdo here. And again, another example of this idea of probably a pax here with a cross on it. And again, you can see where the wing slots in between the angel and the rest of the plank. Methwold, quite a damaged roof, but some beautiful, very similar concept, beautiful beam angels formed using these planks again. Again, the crown of thorns and the presumably would have been hammer and nails of Christ's suffering. Um, I've mentioned, this design spans all over the place in the West. Oh, I thought it was interesting to pop in these two images from the creeks in northwest Norfolk, because these two roofs look quite different, although clearly the angel beams are made in a similar way. At first glance, they look very different. But when I actually mapped what the angels were holding, it was remarkably similar in terms of the design, but clearly undertaken by different craftspeople and also distorted by more modern painting in the case of South Creek. I mentioned that in some churches there's more than one roof, and at Emneth in the west of Norfolk, the nave roof features a variation on the St Nicholas model, in which the angels, they all look slightly kind of up. There's slightly different carving going on here, and they all hold items that would be used in the mass rather than musical instruments and passion emblems. And interestingly, they mirror each other exactly across from north to south. So there are two angels with the chalice and host, for example, one on the north, one on the south, and the same for the other imagery. And their costume is different to St Nicholas because they've got more than one set of wings. They're rather feathery, and some of them have tippets. But I thought it was interesting to put this in because at Outwell, we'll see another roof from Outwell in a bit, but the south aisle roof appears to have been carved by the same group of people who did the Emneth nave roof. And again, you can see some similar imagery going on there, which I thought was interesting. And again, more than one set of wings. At Emneth, I haven't been able to put in loads of examples of these, but at Emneth, interestingly, another thing that differs from St Nicholas is that there are carved wall post figures of saints, at the ends of the wall posts. And some in some roofs, particularly in double hammer beam roofs, you'll find these in niches. And it does make me wonder whether at St Peter Mancroft and at St Nicholas, where there are empty stone niches, whether they would have had saints in them. But clearly, this is additional carved material, and it suggests a hierarchical relationship with the saints below and the angels above, a bit like the screen imagery. Um, then we come to think about imagery a bit more at Milden Hall. Two different roofs. In the nave, the roof that I've been talking about, the one that Michael Rimmer took the beautiful photo of one of the angels of, clearly following St Nicholas Chapel, alternating tie beams and angel hammer beams, local craftsmanship. But at Meldon Hall, there are two aisle roofs. The north aisle in particular is spectacular. Again, it's a hammer beam roof, but this time it has alternating hammer beams with angels, and then hammer beams which have bestial beasts, grotesques, that kind of imagery. And those beasts have quite distinctive roll moulding coming from their mouths, as we'll see in a bit. It's a really elaborate design. It's got loads of imagery throughout it. And here's a detail of one of those grotesque beams. And hold this image of the mouth going on there. The creature beautifully carved into the beam, loads of other imagery going on. A lot of the imagery suggests very elite patronage and suggests a possible link maybe to the Abbey at Bury St Edmunds. And it's interesting actually that I haven't included Bury St Edmunds in this talk because obviously it's in Suffolk, but there's a chancel roof at St Mary which has a lot of these different types of images in a very different kind of format. Anyway, this north aisle roof at Meldon Hall also, as I say, contains rather defaced beam angels. They've been quite bashed about because this is Suffolk after all, wearing ecclesiastical dress. And then at the bottom of the wall posts, there are angels standing over other figures, which appear to be saintly figures. Okay. So it's quite complex. You've got those alternating angel and grotesque beams above, and then you have large angels above saints on the wall posts. Now, it's not unusual to have that kind of combination of angels and grotesque imagery in different formats in roofs, but it is quite unusual to have these alternating beams. And a researcher called Dr. Claire Daunton noticed an apparent relationship between the Milden Hall North Aisle roof and a couple of parish church roofs in northwest Norfolk at Fincham and Outwell. And she wrote about this relationship. At Fincham, basically, there are alternating angelic and grotesque beams. And as at Milden Hall, the grotesque beams have roll mouldings coming out of their mouths and down the braces. And there are good reasons to think this roof is late 15th century rather than earlier. So here we are looking underneath a couple of these beams to show you the kind of relationship. They've had a lot of restoration work. The whole thing was very heavily restored in the early 20th century. But it gives you the idea of this roll moulding coming out of the mouth of the grotesque and then the angel ecclesiastical dress and so forth. And a couple of other examples from the same roof, rather grotesque looking woman wearing a headdress, possibly representing sin. It's quite common to have this kind of juxtaposition of opposites in medieval art. Um, uh, Medieval people enjoyed that play of opposites, but also it's teaching people about good and evil. Um, another couple of examples just to hammer home the point. And seen from the side, you can see that the grotesque figures actually appear to be depicted with some sort of layered drapery to the side. It's very stylized, whereas obviously the angels are feathery. And just to emphasize the point, another pair, where again we have this strange layered drapery effect for the grotesque creature. It's very dark at Fincham and hard to photograph, as is the nave roof at Outwell, which is very much the same style of roof in some ways as at St Nicholas King's Lynn, only with added wall post figures, and unfortunately added treatment, a very dark treatment, which makes it very, very difficult to see the angel beams. So tie beams, angel beams, as you would have at St Nicholas, but also wall post figures, okay, below. And what Dr. Daunton noticed, I don't think she actually climbed the scaffolding, but Hugh Harrison, the architect, took some photos up there for her. And what she noticed was that, yes, obviously the beams are angels, they're very similar to the St. Nicholas concept. Pity they've been covered with this stuff. But the wall post figures looked very different from up on scaffolding at the level where they were placed to how they looked from the ground. And basically, what has obviously happened is a reversal of the relationship at and a reinterpretation of the relationship of the wall post figures at Mildenhall, North Isle. So instead of having angel and saint, big angel and little saint, we have big grotesque figure and or evil figure and small saintly figure, and something clearly had got lost in translation between Mildenhall and Outwell. I should say the reason why we think that Fincham and Outwell followed Mildenhall is to do with the Fincham family and their patronage at these churches, and their relationships with those at Mildenhall. So it's probably a kind of an idea that's been adapted but misinterpreted in the process of the remaking. Leading to a sort of loss in translation between Mildenhall and Outwell. Now, at the end of my research, I'd struggled to get into a church which wasn't on Michael Rimmer's list or the original Bentley Cranch list at Sholdham, which is just up the road from Fincham and not very far from Outwell either. And I managed to get in because they were preparing an exhibition there. It didn't used to be open. At the moment, it is because they're really trying to open it and do a lot of fundraising. It's a roof that needs a lot of repair. But I remember clocking this roof at the end of my research, not being able to really do any research into it at the time, but thinking there was clearly a relationship between this roof and this cluster that Claire Daunton had talked about, Mildenhall, Fincham, and Outwell. And so earlier this year, I went back and had another really good look at all of them. And I also went to the record office to see what I could find out about Sholdham. And it was interesting because I was asked to do a talk about the Sholdham roof to raise some money. And it was quite clear that people there thought that the beam figures were real people, probably certainly rather than angels, and that it wasn't an angel roof. Now, I've yet to come across a late medieval open timber roof with figures that isn't some sort of angel roof. And I really don't believe that people made roofs to the Antichrist or anything. And I'm pretty sure that these are angels. And you can see that there are these beam figures, and then there are little demi-corbels underneath the wall posts. So, holding that in mind, um, I found quite a lot of information about the 1860s restoration, including a reference to angels in the roof, although it's not clear whether they're talking about these beam angels or the demi figures. There's clearly been further restoration work. This rather Art Deco looking angel at the north clearly doesn't look terribly late medieval. But what's interesting is that these figures have roll moulding coming from their mouths, which obviously recalls the design at Fincham and originally at Meldenhall. And there's been an awful lot of restoration at Sholdham, so it's very difficult to see. But my suspicion is that these are angels. I think that they're wearing rather rudimentary ecclesiastical costume. I think is what is meant to be depicted. And I suspect that originally, before all of the repairs, after a lot of damage, that they were possibly folded rather than inserted wings, rather like the wings at Fincham. For these angels, but there's been so much restoration work, it's very difficult to tell. But my suggestion is that these beam figures are angels, but that they have the roll moulding coming from their mouths that the grotesque figures have at Mildenhall and at Fincham. And here's another example where you can see here that whoever's carved this, they're not the same carvers as at Fincham. They're not as accomplished, actually, but they've clearly emulated the layered costume that's actually on the grotesque figures at Fincham. I don't think this is meant to be a grotesque face. I think it's a naively carved one rather than anything else. So just to remind you about those layers of drapery and the roll moulding at Fincham, I think what's happened at Sholdham is something lost in translation, rather like the Outwell wall post figures. There are little demis underneath the wall posts at Sholdham, but pretty well all of them look like restoration work. They don't look angelic, but I suspect that the angels referred to in the restoration account there possibly were some original demi-angels there to start with. So, I hope I've shown you something of the variety of Norfolk angel roofs. The one type of roof that I haven't really mentioned is the cambered tie beam roof, the very flat roofs, which you find at places like Blythborough and in southwest Suffolk and west Essex, and in Cambridge and places like that, where there's very elite patronage. That doesn't seem to have been a Norfolk thing at all. And there don't seem to be any examples of the really early 14th century single frame roofs with angels in Norfolk, whereas there's at least one in Suffolk. But hopefully, I've conveyed something of the variety. There's a lot more to learn about these roofs, particularly because it's quite hard to date a lot of them, except by eye, and there isn't the same dating evidence that there is for things like rood screens. So, anyway, I hope that's been of interest, and my research continues.
Yeah, so you're going to host the questions. Are there any questions in the chat?
There's no questions in the chat at the moment. Sarah, if you could stop sharing your PowerPoint, and then we'd be able to see the sort of the screen of people's faces. Anybody who has a question for Sarah, if you could pop your hands up or pop a question in the chat.
Can I say something?
Go
I'm
for it.
very, 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 very sorry I wasn't here to introduce you, Sarah. I got held up in traffic and I couldn't get back in time. But I've been here, I've listened to practically all your talk, and I really am very grateful. It was a lovely talk.
Thank
I
you
do
ever so
apologize.
much.
I do
Not at all,
apologize.
not at all. Thank you ever so much.
Sarah,
Any
what
questions?
Sarah, what proportion of the angels that you've seen do you think are original? How much of, on as a rough guess, how much survived the great damaging period in the 16th and 17th centuries?
That's interesting because obviously there are a number of roofs where you just don't know what was there originally because of a lack of documentation and the fact they haven't survived. Not in Norfolk, not necessarily because of deliberate damage, but because of the issues to do with water damage and insect damage and so forth. I mean, in Suffolk, it's such a different picture because most of the double hammer beam roofs clearly had. Little relief angels tenoned into the ends of them, but they've lost them. And there's obviously a whole catalogue of William Dowsing asking for angels to be removed there, and the same for part of Cambridge. But in Norfolk, I think it's difficult to assess the amount of loss because of other factors. Um, there are one or two noteworthy roofs where the whole thing has just been completely replaced, as at Martham, for example, where the whole thing's just completely redone. Um, but I think a surprising amount does survive. Again, it's a very interesting question because in terms of the proportion of angel roofs for a county, I've had some interesting discussions with Brendan Chester Cadwell about that because obviously he's looked at quite a few in Somerset, and it's difficult to assess because of um, partly it depends on how many churches have survived as well. So it's a really difficult question to answer that one. I think a remarkable number have survived from what I've seen, but it really is impossible to be totally sure about the proportion. Yeah.
Sorry to have
Um,
asked a difficult one for your first question.
May
um,
I may I ask something?
go
These
for it, Sarah.
angels or grotesques or whatever with wood timber
Yes.
coming from their mouths. Do you think that relates to the Green Man imagery at all?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Actually, somebody did a thesis about the Green Man down in Kent. They finished a couple of years ago, and I'm waiting anxiously for her book because I think she's reinterpreted the whole thing. I certainly think it's quite an elite device, and it may well relate to those other kind of images, such as that. Um, but it's something that seems to come from the more it seems to derive from roofs that have been made by more elite craftspeople for more elite people, I think. Mm.
We've got a couple of well, lots of people saying thank you and what an interesting talk in the chat, Sarah. But
You.
also a couple of questions from Simon Wood. He says, when is it an angel and not an angel?
That's a very good question, and I also ask when is it an angel roof and when isn't it as well? To be an angel, I think it tends to have curly hair, an appearance which really goes back to the late antique, actually, to some extent, and it definitely has toes rather than shoes. Um, Other than that, it's a good question because it could be wearing ecclesiastical gear or it could be feathered. So it's one or other of those. But yeah, I mean, when I first looked at one or two of the roofs that had other imagery and alongside the angels, I kind of, it's like, do you say that a roof is an angel roof if it has stone angelic corbels at the ends of the wall post rather than timber ones, but no other angelic imagery? I think it's a really difficult question, but they're probably all angel roofs in their own right, which is why I sort of decided not to try and count them too much, because I think there's confusion because of different interpretations by the people paying for them at the time and making them.
And then Simon also goes on to ask, does the external roof material make any substantial difference to the design?
That's interesting. I mean, I guess that uh, actually this brings on another interesting question, which is the pitch of these roofs, because I did measure the pitches of a lot of these roofs. Um, Basically, when I first started, I read various bits about roof structure that suggested a linear development towards much flatter roofs, flatter pitches, leaded roofs. Um, but clearly, a lot of early steeper pitched roofs have been thatched. So that is a good question. But what I found with angel roofs was that the pitch of the roofs varies enormously. There isn't one approach. It seems to be a different approach at each place. So the pitches really varied quite considerably throughout the period. There wasn't one development towards flatter. I would say it was a real mishmash. But yeah, I suppose ultimately really steep thatch and less steep leaded, I guess. Yeah.
And then he also says, were the carvings all done locally at the building or subcontracted to national carvers?
That's an interesting question as well. I think there were definitely people who travelled around to do this work. In terms of not so much the carving, but the whole roof. You know, the kind of carpentry as well as the carving. The two do go together, where you've got beam angels because the beams are part of the structure. But I'm only aware of two contracts in Norfolk for roofs. One is basically relates. A roof at Ashwellthorpe to a carpenter at Saul in North Norfolk, and the other one is about a chancel roof at Hardley. And from that contract, it's obvious that the roof was actually made in Harleston, and then it was made well in advance, 3 years before the chancel was built, and then it was taken to the site so that they could be sure that it was going to fit, the building was going to be the right size to fit the roof. So that's, I mean, clearly a couple of my examples suggest more kind of carpenters and carvers from outside the region, possibly. But I think an awful lot of them were done within the region, and the work would have been done and then taken to the site. Yeah.
Thank you.
I can't help thinking.
Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, for example, with Mildenhall Nave, I'm pretty sure a group of people who had worked at St Nicholas went to Mildenhall and did the work for that roof.
And then we have a question from, well, it says AJ, so I don't know what their name is. That's some initials. Which other countries also have churches with angel roofs, or are there any other countries with angel roofs?
I've struggled to find them so far. I went to Brittany while I was doing my research. They have some open timber roofs there. They look a bit like West Country roofs here, with the more kind of rounded structure. And I did find some timber roof imagery there. Whether I would really call them angel roofs or not is an interesting question, because they had different types of imagery in them. I certainly saw at least one painted angel roof there. I asked one of my contemporaries at UEA, who went to Normandy to look out for me, but what he found was that a lot of the roofs were stone vaulted rather than open timber. And I think the problem with looking at European roofs is that in a lot of cases the churches haven't survived, or the roofs have been built of stone. So I've yet to find a really convincing angel roof. I suspect in Brittany there might be some relationship with roofs in the West Country and Wales, a sort of more Celtic interpretation.
And Suzanne Allgood says, how long would you think it would take to carve one angel?
That's a good question. I mentioned I went up King's Lynn with Gerald Adams, who's now a retired master carver, but he was still working when we went there. And he actually purchased a huge, great bit of oak because he was I think his retirement project was going to be to make one of those King's Lynn angels. And I got the impression he thought he might be able to knock it out in a month. I had a go at doing a little demi-angel from St. Nicholas and didn't get it finished because I was too tentative and didn't want to stab myself. But I know that he did actually knock out one of those pretty quickly. But yeah, for a beam one, I mean, I guess it depends if you're doing it all of the time, and you get the impression that you've got master carvers and apprentices working when you look at the uh, relative quality of some of the carving. Um, it is possible that more than one person would work on the same angel and do different aspects of it as well. I think Gerald thought that might have gone on in some of them. But yeah, he thought about a month. Or a demi, I can see someone's asked what a demi angel is. I should have said it's basically just a kind of waist upwards angel, so half an angel,
And
no
then
toes.
Claire Terry asks, where would the parish have found information on the nine orders of the angels, please?
There was a book called The Golden Legend that was published in the 14th century, and I think it would have ideas from that would have filtered down through the clergy. I think obviously people wouldn't have sat there reading it themselves, but I think the idea was kind of around because of that publication.
And I think perhaps if we take two more questions, otherwise we might be here all night.
Here all night.
Um, yes, we have one from Brenda. It says, were angels going out of fashion in the 1520s, a reaction to the coming Reformation, as the patrons would be wasting their money?
Interesting question. I mean, I've written a bit about how I think, obviously, there was a lot of religious controversy throughout this period, and people have been already been kind of burned for their non-conventional beliefs. And I think there was a lot. I think it was probably quite dangerous time to express religious belief because you could quite easily get accused of not being orthodox and get in trouble. But and it may well be that some of these roofs are an expression of orthodox belief to kind of make sure that you didn't get into trouble. But uh, certainly towards the early 16th century, I guess there are still roofs being made, angel roofs being made, but there are perhaps less of them by that stage. It doesn't mean that angels disappear from churches. There are one or two painted angel roofs that date from the 17th century in the country, one in Somerset, for example, but they are rather different in interpretation, and I think it certainly became less fashionable to create those roofs. They're thinner on the ground by then, but I guess that is because it's getting a bit more controversial as to as to whether you follow the Orthodox religion or not.
Make a point about you were mentioning about uh, carpenters coming from another town where they're working. There are documentary
Mm.
records of master masons who were working at Lynn,
Yes.
moving on to West Winch to presumably just to supervise the work there rather than do it.
Yeah.
So was
Yeah.
there the same relationship with carpenters? Was there a master carpenter who oversaw things rather than was purely hands-on?
I think there was, and but I also think, I mean, it's interesting because certainly with some of the roofs that show that influence from King's Lynn, there are certainly some of the same people working on those other roofs. So some of the people must have travelled and actually, had actually done that work. But yeah, I'm sure that's true that that you would have somebody overseeing it who was taking control of the whole design. I
Okay.
don't think they got paid quite as much as the Masons, did they? But I think there are documents that show what they got paid. I mean, that's the frustrating thing that we know the names of some carpenters and carvers in different centres in regions like Norwich and Lynn and so forth. But it's actually pinning names down to specific buildings that is really difficult to do. So you end up with the patrons being better known than the craftspeople, which seems a bit unfair. Mm.
Okay. And finally, which local roofs are the best to look at, would you say? Have you got a top five?
Top five. Oh gosh, this is really, really difficult. I mean, I've got to say St. Peter Hungate because I'm a trustee there and I love that roof so much. It's absolutely brilliant. So I love Hungate. Um, I do. I really love the roof at King's Lynn. I guess partly because I saw it so much, so I got really familiar with it. But I think it was an incredibly inventive approach. Starting off. Oh gosh, beyond that, it gets really, really difficult. I mean, obviously Corsten's amazing, but I actually was rather fond of those Saul ones because I didn't expect to find them there, and they were so understated in comparison. Um, yeah, I don't know about five. It's really difficult to pin
No.
down, to be
Gissing.
honest.
What
Yeah,
about
I'd probably
Gissing?
well, Gissing's incredible. Yes, I mean it has got a lot of restoration angels in it, but the structure is
Mm.
superb. And I did spend a lot of time looking because that's also got saintly imagery, really bashed up saintly imagery in it. I think that roof probably relates to Coddenham, which in Suffolk, which is just further south. There are some similarities between the two. They have both been a bit bashed about and restored, but yeah, I mean, it was just gobsmacking to walk in there and see that. I love the fact that some of the roofs. Oh, in Suffolk, another one that I absolutely love is at Earl Stonham, and I probably should have put a picture of that in because I mean it's an incredibly elaborate late roof, but uh, it's interesting how it relates to the transepts because it's a church with transepts again. But the roof posts just hang down over the arches to the transepts, and it makes a good contrast to show why the Hungate design is so sophisticated.
Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much.
Thank you. And may I mention, in case it wasn't mentioned before, um, that Sarah has published Reframing the Room, 15th Century Angel Roofs, and The Rood in East Anglia in 2020, and Material Presence, Eternal Memory, Donors and Chancel Screens in Late Medieval East Anglia this year. So look out for those, especially the former, I imagine, because that will be more about the angel roofs. But that was lovely. Lovely Christmas angels from Sarah. Thank you ever so much. And
Thank you.
we hope
Thank you
to
very
see you
much.
again on a trip to look at the angels sometime.
Definitely,
Thank
yes,
you.
a tour.
And happy Christmas to everybody. And we'll see you in the new year. Okay. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Night, everyone. Thank you
Good
ever so
night.
much.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.